Festspace project, which is a European-funded project by the Humanities and the Research Area funder, and they have a call that focuses on the idea of public space. So it's about public space in Europe and how public spaces could be, historically, have been more inclusive. So that talks to issues around about the migration, talks to issues of multiculturalism, but also about the kind of idea of new communities and new populations entering our cities, and how potentially public spaces may change, may be more welcoming, may create kind of interactions between different sorts of groups.
El que mirem són tres grans blocs: espai públic, esdeveniment i inclusió social. El que intentem fer és observar des de quin punt un esdeveniment que passa en espai públic té aspectes d'inclusió i de diversitat, tant des del punt de vista de l'acció com des del punt de vista de planificació i desenvolupament. Som una col·laboració amb 4 altres universitats i 5 ciutats: Glasgow, Londres, Göteborg, Barcelona i Dublín.
The London-based part of the Festspace project focused exclusively on parks. We were particularly interested in how festivals and events affect the inclusivity of London's parks. We looked at parks across London, but then we wanted to focus on one park in particular, and we focused our attention on Finsbury Park in North London, where I'm standing today. So the aim of the research was really to understand the dynamics associated with festivals and events by looking at what was happening in the park when festivals and events were happening, but also analysing the park at times when events weren't happening.
In the Gothenburg project, the primary focus is public space event governance, and more specifically how the public cultural event is used as a policy tool to fulfill societal goals of a more inclusive city. The underpinning argument for this is that governance is one of the most significant influences on how events develop and eventually become a facilitator of spatial sustainable development.
A Barcelona, el que fem és centrar-nos en esdeveniments culturals i els dividim en 3 tipologies. Esdeveniments d'indústria cultural, festivals de cinema, de teatre, de literatura, etc. Cultura tradicional i popular, tots aquells esdeveniments vinculats amb calendari festiu, etc., festes majors, la Mercè, etc., altres tipus d'activitats de cultura tradicional. I després, un aspecte per nosaltres és molt important, esdeveniments de diversitat cultural. L'any nou xinès, el dia del Pakistan, el dia nacional d'Equador, etc.
What we're really looking at Glasgow is both a kind of focus on particular spaces in our research and also particular festivals and events that interact with those spaces. So that two-pronged kind of approach. So the first is that we're looking at particular spaces. So we're looking at, for example, squares. So Glasgow is a famous civic square, George Square, where there's a lot of festivals and events that have been held over a long period, from sort of protest demonstrations, marches, to kind of civic events, but increasingly also sort of quite commercial events or events that have been associated with large-scale sporting events. We're also interested in streetscapes, so we're looking at sort of street festivals like Merchant City Festival, which is a festival that takes place in Glasgow, and again the goal is to understand how people might reclaim or interact with streets, because again there's some evidence to suggest that can be very valuable when we think about drawing different people into city centre environments.
We're interested to know whether by participating in events people feel a better sense of inclusion, a better sense of belonging, a better sense of connection to the city. We've also been interested in commemorative events because Ireland is in a decade of commemorations at the moment. So we're interested to know the extent to which people engage with commemorative events, the meanings they take from them, and whether they help people develop a better connection and understanding of the city where they live.
I think events are for a lot of different things, and I think it can even be something that goes back to the beginning of events. They're for the community, they're for people celebrating, sharing collective values, renegotiating identities, sort of in an abstract sense. But I think ultimately they're for an everyday, sort of break from everyday life. I think that they can definitely play a role in more inclusive societies. You can get people you would never meet before, just interacting, having a good time together in a space.
I've been here in Glasgow for 8 years only, and in these 8 years I've seen a huge change in terms of the attitude of residents towards the city, and I think events played a huge role on that.
El Covid ens ha afectat a tots, també ha afectat el projecte i sobretot ha afectat el sector dels esdeveniments a la ciutat de Barcelona, i sobretot els culturals. Totes aquelles activitats i festivitats que s'han desenvolupat planificades dintre d'un marc de pandèmia, és a dir, el redisseny complet de les activitats i les accions en el marc del que es podia fer. Que el que han fet és canviar la seva estructura, fer moltes accions però molt més petites per reducció d'audiències i públics, etc. Hi ha moltíssima gent, tant des dels treballadors com els col·laboradors, però fins i tot l'audiència o els participants que no va voler que es cancel·lessin els esdeveniments.
The pandemic affected our research in various ways. Luckily, we'd started our fieldwork early, so by the time the pandemic struck in March 2020, we'd already done quite a lot of our fieldwork. Once the pandemic was here, we took a lot of our research online. So we interviewed people online and we did a lot of online research to complement what we'd already done. In August 2021, we were able to get back into the park and resume our on-site research. And there were lots of interesting festivals events happening by that stage, so that provided some extra examples that we could consider.
The 19 pandemic has had a major impact on the way we've been able to undertake fieldwork for the project. So initially we were going to be doing lots of embodied work where we're going to be immersed in particular contexts, we're going to be observing in person, where we're going to be interacting with people, interviewing, surveying people. Clearly many and most festivals and events in the traditional form of an in-person event were cancelled from the period of March 2020 onwards. So obviously that had a big impact on the way that we think about public space, outdoor public space, and how people were interacting in it. But it did actually open up some possibilities where we had to pivot the research to look at, I guess, a concept of digital public space, where people were still having festival and events, but having them in a mediated form, online, digitally. And I think there's an interesting element to the dynamic of in-person events, but also hybrid events, in terms of whether these actually might be quite restrictive and might actually, again, further exclude particular populations who perhaps feel less comfortable attending or engaging with those events.
Since March 2020, Ireland adopted very strict health guidelines, such that really throughout 2020 and much of 2021, festival and event activity was not held in public spaces as at all it would be normally. So this had a real effect on our research and we had to change direction. So we began focusing on festival organisers, asking them how the pandemic had affected their work, and of course we found that a lot of their work went online. We began talking to city authorities to try to understand how they were reconfiguring space and what this might mean for events. And we began investigating how they were thinking about events strategically as the city tries to emerge from the pandemic.
One could argue that the event sector, together with some other sectors, have been the big pandemic losers. And the reason for this is that focus of the pandemic restrictions that have been applied has been on the limitations of people to gather in bigger groups in or through public events. Consequently, at the same time as many parts of the everyday life of the city of Gothenburg have been low intense, however still up and running, public events and festivals have been cancelled, causing huge financial emergency situations for both private and public event organizations. And this is something that we have focused on from a governance perspective in the Gothenburg project.
Molts dels que som activistes de la cultura popular opinem que si ens vam adaptar a la nostra vida normal, la vida diària, la vida festiva, el moment festiu també s'havia d'adaptar. Per tant, les festes s'han seguit celebrant però han tingut una afectació molt grossa. Van haver-hi per mi dos tipus de resposta. Una era la resposta d'alguns col·lectius, volien posposar la festa o anul·lar-la per més endavant, i altra gent el que defensava era que la festa no es posposa, la festa, la celebració, sobretot aquestes festes majors associades a patronatges de moments concrets de l'any, el que no es pot fer mai una festa és anul·lar-la. Sí que un espectacle s'anul·la, però una festa, que és la celebració d'una comunitat, que es reconeix a ella mateixa comunitat, això no es pot anul·lar.
One of the things we've produced is an inclusive design guide, which looks at the way in which we can advise through our research practitioners, policymakers and others as to how they might actually host festival events in public space in a way that's inclusive. And also the way that we've been able to kind of influence policymakers in terms of hosting a series of kind of engagement events that encourage policymakers to talk with academics about how they might be able to think about festival events being, as said, an opportunity for greater inclusion, as opposed to being something that maybe privatises public space or controls or manages public space in a way that excludes people.
We generate 4 main outcomes. The first one, the development of a huge database related to the cultural events in Barcelona. This database has been developed in the strong collaboration with the City Council, Barcelona City Council, especially with the Institute of Culture. The second outcome that we generate, strongly related with the database, is a cartography of events in the city of Barcelona. This cartography identified cultural events typology, but also cultural events typology by the use of the space. The third outcome of our research is related with the identification of the main symbolic space of Barcelona, the opening speeches of the main festivity in the city, la Festa Major de Barcelona, la Mercè, and their pregons, the opening speeches. We analyzed the opening speeches from 1975, Turning to Democracy, and until 2020. In that case, we generate a model of analysis that we hope that could be used for future investigations, as well as we observe different kind of ideas and concepts in deep. The fourth outcome of our research is linked with in-depth case studies. We selected with different variables the 12 cases that we would like to analyze. Through all these in-depth case studies, what we try to answer is the main questions of the research. We observe how COVID have been a factor, but also how diversity and inclusion are part of the design, the organization and development of these events. We observe future requirements, but also the social legacy of these events.
We think there are 2 main outcomes of the research. First, we think we've really increased understanding of how parks could be programmed with inclusivity in mind. So programming gets us thinking about how festivals and events can be combined with other activities that are happening in the park and everyday use. The second key outcome is to better understand some of the problematic effects associated with fenced ticketed festivals. And our research has generated lots of lessons and recommendations that can think about how some of those negative effects can be better managed and reduced.
We conclude that staging events in public space is quite a complex process, as the city is trying to achieve different kinds of objectives at the same time. On the ground, we found some very inclusive practices, but teasing out the connectivity between these practices and the strategic thinking at city level in terms of diversity, city animation, economic regeneration was quite difficult. In the context of the pandemic and recovering the city post-pandemic, we would say that festivals and events definitely have a role to play in encouraging people to come back into the city and reclaim city spaces. The city has been thinking about events in terms of what it calls passive animation. So it's been devising trails, for example, and to encourage people to move around the city spaces. So it's used light installations on civic buildings and in different kinds of spaces like parks and squares. It's used art installations to encourage footfall, to animate different kinds of spaces and to encourage people to come back in and move around the city centre.
The main outcome of the Gothenburg project revolves around 2 main topics. The first one is about how the project contributes to a deeper understanding for the complexity of public space event governance as a tool for sustainable urban development. A second outcome of the project revolves around the pandemic as an opportunity to better understand the value of public space event governance in society. We are currently investigating the restrictions and support measures for the cultural event sector implemented during the pandemic across the 5 cities participating in Festspace. And this will allow us to understand how the impact of COVID-19 has materialized in different policy measures for the event sector across the 5 European countries.
We've been able to I think really show how across 5 European cities there's real kind of commonality in some respects in the approach to public space being used for festival and events, which I think is useful and informative, but we're also being able to show the differences. So one of the things I guess I think we've been able to contribute in the project as a whole is an assessment of those differences in these different cultural contexts and political contexts, and also we'll be able to make some sort of recommendations for how we might see public space and festival events developing in the future.